Many years ago, I was speaking to another congregation, which at the time included a question and answer period with the speaker as a part of the Sunday morning service. And that morning, I had given a talk of mine called I Don't Have a Suit, that has to do with our experience of feeling like an insider or an outsider. During the Q&A, one woman was sharing with the congregation the pain of having to recently admit her elderly father into an assisted living facility, where she explained there was assigned seating in the dining room. Unbeknownst to my dad, she said he got seated at the cool table. Because soon enough, one of the other residents rolled up alongside him and commented sadly, "That used to be my place until you got here." Bad news, folks. It seems like in some ways we never get out of junior high. I attended Jefferson Junior High in Long Beach, as my father had some 30 years earlier. In fact, when he was 12 years old, he was on his bike across the street from the school, having wrapped up his paper route, late one Friday afternoon in March 1933, when the big earthquake hit. And he watched as his school collapsed into a heap of rubble. Far from rubble in my mind, Jefferson is a time and place that still lives so vividly in my consciousness. And like it or not, it was a shaping force in the person I would become and how I would come to see my place in the world. Yeah, middle school, junior high can be a potent time for many of us. A time of self-awakening and discovery, for many a time of desperate yearning to belong and yet always feeling the outsider. For some, a time of enormous cruelty, either as the victim or perpetrator or both. For some, a time of terrifying vulnerability. I was a gay 11-year-old boy when I started at Jefferson, and it was the first time I ever had to get naked in front of other little boys and suit up and shower together for PE. Gerald Colucci had chest hair in 7th grade. And some of the other boys clearly hadn't begun puberty yet. My God, my memories of those times, the people, they are fixed in a 13-year-old's perceptions. And it can take years to tease apart those perceptions and begin to see one another, including ourselves, in a truly multidimensional way. Perhaps some of you saw the recent film a year or so ago called 8th Grade. It is a devastating, achingly poignant portrait of this rite of passage, shot through an utterly contemporary lens, and yet in some ways only going to prove the old adage that the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the film, Kayla's 13, and she's enduring the last week of classes after a disastrous 8th grade year. Kayla makes these little shoebox time capsules, including a video time capsule as a sort of gift and touchstone to her future self. She had made one upon graduating elementary school to the future middle school graduate whom she had imagined would have it all figured out by now, and that life would be sweet. Much in the same way many of us might have imagined once upon a time that life will be so much easier once we get to be an adult. Well, this talk is the opposite of such a time capsule in a way. Rather than reaching forward in time, I'm reaching back to a few specific characters at Jefferson, teachers more precisely, who are fixed in my mind in at most 2 dimensions. And if I dare to see them in a multidimensional way, what might I discover about myself? Did any of you ever find it nearly impossible to conceive of your teachers as human beings, living a normal life outside of the classroom? I mean, we might have known if they were married or had kids, but just couldn't quite wrap our heads around it. Perhaps it's a function for those in my generation for whom teachers showed up to work in dresses, suits, and ties. It was hard enough to imagine them in casual clothes, let alone living a normal life. I remember how shocking it was to see Mr. Keller getting an ice cream cone at Thrifty Drugstore. Or to see a teacher cry. Mrs. McCants was the first African-American teacher I ever had, 8th grade English. I simply adored her. I can still sense how disorienting it was to see her openly weep in front of the class on Friday, April 5th, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. It was impossible to grasp the magnitude of such an event. For her, for any of us really, I was coming of age in this narrow window of time in which assassinations had become the norm. It took decades to hold the magnitude of such events in a larger historical context. Well, several years ago, Ted Othnier, an old friend from the neighborhood and a fellow altar boy at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, sent me an email including a link to a then 12-year-old obituary for Claude Evans. Mr. Evans had been our 9th grade geometry teacher at Jefferson. Now, Teddy, who sadly passed away himself recently, knew everything about everybody and every place that had been our world at Signal Hill and Long Beach during those years. Everybody should have a Teddy. I remembered Mr. Evans mostly as a big, bald, humorless, seemingly ancient man in his mid-50s with a deep voice and bad breath and chalk dust always flocking the dark suits he wore, the residue of so many triangles and parallelograms drawn on the chalkboard. Mr. Evans also led the after-school slide rule club, if you know. And Dorcosaurus that I was, I showed up for the first few meetings, equipped with my little slide rule from St. Bob Drugstore, though I lost interest pretty quickly. But don't you know, when it came time to take yearbook photos for campus clubs, I and some of my friends showed up for that slide rule club photo. Hey, it was a chance to get out of class. We thought we were so clever. Well, Mr. Evans is little more than a cartoon in my memory. And yet when I read his obituary, I was filled with so much tenderness for this man I never got to know, though I'd spent an hour with him every day for a year. I didn't know he'd served in the Army Air Corps as my dad had during World War II. I didn't know he'd been co-captain of a Rose Bowl winning football team from Berkeley. I couldn't have known that he lost an adult son in 1984. But the line that pierced the deepest revealed what I really didn't know. Anyone who knew Claude knew most importantly that he was one who would help anyone in need, and he would do so with a warmth and a smile and no expectation of anything in return. The 13-year-old within me did not recognize this portrait at all and felt ashamed, while the 60-something-year-old man only felt sorrow for this missed opportunity to connect with an extra layer of sadness because the obituary was already 12 years old. As if that somehow solidified this was an opportunity gone forever, much in the same way we might feel a different kind of sadness when we hear many years after the fact that someone we had known or cared about once had died. Leaves me wondering how little we ever really know of each other. Well, 20-some years ago, late in August, on a Friday afternoon after work, I drove down to Long Beach to meet an old college friend, Carrie, to go kayaking on the Alamedas Bay. Carrie and I had both grown up in Long Beach, even went to the same high school, though we didn't know each other there. We met a few years later in an engineering class at UCLA. But the Bay was a place that for each of us held these indelible, joyful memories. So as we paddled around, we did a lot of, oh, I remember one time, and did you ever go over there? And you remember the popsicles they sold at Woody's Goodies? It was an enchanted afternoon. As the sun began to go down, we turned in our kayaks, and though we were soggy and a little sandy, we walked down 2nd Street through Belmont Shore to go grab some dinner at a now long-gone Long Beach institution, Hoff's Hut. Even then, though, it had lost all the tacky familial charm we had remembered as kids. It had become sort of slick and hip and corporatized. But as we were walking down 2nd Street toward the restaurant, I commented to Carrie, I have the strangest sensation I'm going to run into somebody from my distant past. Isn't that weird? We go into the restaurant, we give the hostess our name, I turn around, I cannot believe my eyes. There sits my 8th grade gym teacher, Mr. Lineberger, the devil incarnate. Never quite like the other boys, gym class seemed only designed to drive that point home. And as if the other boys in class couldn't be counted on to underscore that difference every single day, Mr. Lineberger could be counted on to bring up the rear. Eselun, you mean to tell me you can't jump over that? You couldn't make that basket? You couldn't catch that ball? Go give me 2 laps. There he sat, still a large man, still with close-cropped hair, still with no neck, but now with a cane and a face slightly askew that led me to think he likely had a stroke. I pointed out the materialization of my premonition to Carrie. And she whipped a camera out of her purse right away and said, "We've got to go say hello. Quick, I'll take your picture." I knew she was right, of course, but not for any of the reasons she would have assumed. I knew this was a threshold for me to cross, because I knew if I say hello to him, I will also have to come out to him, because sooner than later, a question will be asked about wife and kids. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Lineberger?" "Well, yeah, who are you?" I reintroduced myself and offered my hand to shake. And he took my hand, he didn't let go. He pulled me down to sit next to him, and he's not letting go of my hand. And for the next few moments, I'm his captive audience. Can I get an entire encapsulated version of his previous 40-some years? I hear about the wife, the kids, the grandkids, the retirement, the stroke, and then he finally asks, "So what about you, Mike? How many kids you got?" "None," I answered. "Well, why not? What's your wife do?" Here we go. "Well, I'm not married. I'm gay. I share my life with a man, and I've lived with him for about 19 years now." The silence hung there in the room in a moment as awkward as junior high itself. While he looked around as if hoping someone would offer him a Q-tip to clean out his ears. "Are you shitting me?" he said. No, I'm not. And I realized this too was a threshold. I had spent my entire life carrying a sense of apology for being gay, making adjustments, accommodations to everyone else's discomfort, to the awkwardness, and for once, I was giving it back. "Here, you deal with it." He fussed, he fidgeted, and he finally spits out, "Well, that's okay with me, I guess." "Gee, thanks." More to comfort himself than me, really, but just then the hostess calls our name and we're seated for dinner, and that was that. But I have to say, during the entire meal, my heart didn't stop pounding in my chest. I thought my chest was going to explode. For in that moment, he was not a feeble old man, and I was not an out, proud, 40-something, self-actualized gay man. I was 13, and I had just come out to my 8th grade gym teacher. Sam Sanders, the host of the NPR podcast, It's Been a Minute, recently observed that coming out is not just declaring yourself to the world. It's declaring yourself to each earlier version of yourself and letting that person know that they're cool too. Yeah, gym class was by far the most torturous aspect of junior high for me. It all started day 1, 7th grade. That year, my teacher was Mr. Dennis, a short, affable enough man with a Detroit haircut. Short, flat top on top, held up with butch wax long on the sides, going behind the ear. Even in 1966, that haircut was a few years out of date. Mr. Dennis showed an obvious preference for the more athletic boys in class, and they returned the favor by affectionately calling him Coach. Well, day 1, 7th grade, after the trauma of suiting up, Mr. Dennis tested us on how far we could throw a football, how many times we could hike it between our legs and hit the center of a bicycle inner tube hanging on the chain link fence behind us within some specified period of time. I was a big sissy boy. I'd rather practice waltz steps out in right field than concentrate on any softball game. I had never touched a football, let alone thrown one. I got an F. The first in my life. Mortified, humiliated, I can still feel the shame and disgrace of being summoned into Mr. Meyer's office, a 7th grade counselor, and told I was to be placed in special PE, which was PE designed for boys with special needs, disabilities, handicaps, more commonly and disparagingly referred to as ortho PE. And if you appeared to be able-bodied, the culture was such at the time that if you were put in special PE, you might as well change schools. I confronted Mr. Dennis the next day. "Did you recommend that I be put in special PE?" Kind of ballsy when I think about it. He sheepishly answered yes. I think also kind of knowing he was also condemning me to a sort of social death sentence. My only saving grace in the end was that the gifted math class met in the same period as special PE, and math trumped out over football, so I was relegated to regular PE, where I spent a lot of time on benches, surreptitiously mapping out cha-cha steps with my feet. The crazy irony is that very few years later, I began a career as a professional dancer. Physical ability and coordination, agility weren't my issue. But because I didn't fit the cultural norms of what a boy was expected to like, didn't excel at the things at which a boy was expected to excel, I was somehow seen as an affront to that culture, and I was labeled handicapped because of it. But you know what? I'm almost over it. In that same email that Ted had sent, including the link to the obituary for Mr. Evans, there was also a link to an article about Mr. Dennis. This one from the Salt Lake City Daily Herald. James Dennis, 73, retired middle school teacher, former bishop in the Mormon Church, was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life for the sexual assault and molestation of 17 girls, 4 of whom were his granddaughters.
Oh.
His son Gary, quoted in the article, as saying that his father had assaulted his first victim some 50 years earlier. That would have meant that Mr. Dennis's little enterprise had been well underway when he had been my teacher. Another close friend of the family was quoted as saying, "We were all so shocked. If only we had seen something, maybe we could have done something to stop it." Yeah, the things we don't see. Almost more chilling than the headline was the mugshot included in the article. Of course, the Detroit haircut was long gone, and yet despite the now sagging jowls and the orange jumpsuit, it was most definitely my tormentor. Same cold blue eyes, staring blankly at the camera, with this expression that was not so much a grimace or a scowl, so much as it was one of surrender. The jig is up. It's all over. Complete and total disgrace. Now, if this article had been about any other perpetrator, any stranger, I'm certain my response would have been righteous, moral, outrage, and disgust. Lock the bastard up, throw away the key. Given whom he represents in my own biography, I might have thought there'd be another layer, a flavor of schadenfreude, if you will, delight in his demise. But neither was the case. I only felt deep, profound sadness. And I must admit, my sadness was not for his victims in that moment, but for him. Not only sadness, but even a kind of softness for the perpetrator of these crimes. And I'm left wondering about that sadness and about that softness. Here, this article in the Daily Herald confronts my 13-year-old perceptions of who Mr. Dennis was. Perceptions that had remained safely unchanged for those same 50 years. And as with each of these stories, I watched as those perceptions crumbled right before my eyes. Just like Jefferson itself crumbled right before my father's eyes in 1933. Leaves me to wonder if such earthquakes aren't such a bad thing, metaphorically speaking, giving us a chance to reinterpret that which we thought was so fixed and solid, giving us a chance to see through walls that hid things that should have been seen. It took 50 years to bring him to justice, after all. But I come back to why the sadness, why the softness? Is it because, like it or not, Mr. Dennis and I did share a metaphorical minute waltz in the cosmic dance of our lives, and so he somehow puts a human face on an inhuman deed? Is that it? Is it because of some deep, abiding sense and inherent worth and dignity of all human beings? Perhaps, but I don't think so. Or could it be something approaching true compassion, if only for the complete humiliation, degradation of another human being? I don't know. I only know I felt and I feel sadness. In the film, 8th Grade, Kayla opens the shoebox time capsule she had made for herself upon graduating elementary school. And when she's confronted with the unmet dreams and expectations of her younger self, she finds it too painful, overwhelming in fact, so much so that she asks her father to be a witness to a ritual burning of the time capsule, not wanting to leave any trace of evidence of such unmet dreams. Even while he plaintively asks her, "Are you sure?" I know I didn't want her to burn it either. Now, if Mr. Dennis had made a time capsule at 13 for himself at 73, it most certainly would not have included that orange jumpsuit and that mugshot. But then again, had I made one for myself at 13, for myself at 64, there is very little of my life that could have been imagined. The joy or the pain of it. I certainly could never have imagined being an oncology chaplain. Possibly most inconceivable in 1966 would be that I'd be sharing my life with Scott for 41 years as an out, proud, legally married gay man who still can't throw a football. So what about you? What might your 13-year-old self have to say to you today? And what, if anything, might you have to say to him or her? Might those earlier versions of ourselves know deep in their bones that they're cool too? May there be love. May there be compassion. May there be room for all of us at the cool table. So be it, thank you.